just have the great honor to introduce Amy, Sara, Carroll, and Ricardo Dominguez from Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0.
So, muchas gracias, Mike Bonnano, alias Artmark, alias Yes Man, and the community here, which is really amazing, and what we've been sort of learning in a lived way, Amy and I, and our son Zay is back there running the camera, so make sure that I get my best shot on my best side, of course. So one of the things that Amy, I think, should speak to next is the project of Draw a Line. And so I'm going to, Amy, if you'll come up and sort of take us through the gesture.
Sure thing. So thank you so much for the introduction and the warm welcome here. Hello, everyone. I wanted to also begin with a land acknowledgement, and that is that our presentation was put together on the lands of the Kumeyaay peoples, the past and future and present lands. So from there, speaking of land and territory, this exercise, I often have students in introductory border studies classes engage in this particular exercise that you humored us in engaging tonight. And what I want us to be thinking about, or what I was hoping we could think about, by way of having a conversation, so we also get to know you a little bit. It's really weird to be up here speaking in the mic and all of you are there. So we would really love for you to, before we even present our own work, the plan for this evening is that we would hear a little bit about, from people who would like to share what they drew, what they were thinking about behind the drawing. We'll talk a little bit about this, then we'll present to you some of our own work, and both our individual work and collaborative work that we've done. And then we will engage in another short exercise that we have planned for you. So this is something like a hybrid talk workshop. And then there'll be time for Q&A. So that's the schedule. So I'm wondering right now if we have a mic over here, if anybody would like to share how they engage this particular, I don't want to call it an assignment, but suggested exercise, right? We had asked that you not use your phones, which is really the tough part of this, right? Not immediately going to devices of any sort, computers, phones, whatever. So who would like to start us off? We have a volunteer?
Hi, I'm Jason. So I drew the border of the North and South Korea. I'm originally from Korea. And kind of what I want to draw was that, we wrote it there, draw the line, but borders are often not lines. And in Korea, it's not physically lined, because between the North and South Korean border, there's a thin piece of land called the demilitarized zone, or often called the DMZ. So it haven't been touched by both North and South Korean regime for almost 7 decades. So ironically, this part is like the most ecologically rich piece of land in the peninsula. No human touch. However, also I drew some small dots. From the 80s and the 90s, each North, I don't know who started first, but they start to put small military bases in the demilitarized zone. Like they start to put dots of small bases. So like right now, it's secret, but everyone knows that there are a lot of small bases there. I have friends who served there too. It was kind of interesting. So it's a demilitarized zone where we have the richest ecosystem probably in the world. 7 decades no touch. But the only human society there is also army. So it's an interesting piece of border. Thank you.
So what I really appreciate about your sharing your drawing with us is immediately we're complicating how we understand borders and borderlands, right? This kind of question of the most ecologically rich zone, also just the shape that we're being presented. So this is really lo-fi map making in a certain sense, but it's something else too. We're conceptualizing here how we understand borderlands. Who wants to go next? Another volunteer. Come on up. Please.
Should I take this off? Okay, so I just did the American-Mexico line. I actually lived on the West Coast for about 5 years. So I lived in California and actually traveled through the border to Mexico. And Baja California is the state of Mexico that I traveled to. I drew a huge flag here because that's the first thing that I noticed as soon as I crossed the border. There's like a huge flag which I have never seen before in my entire life. Yeah, and I also drew our professor right here. He was holding a coffee right here, standing at Troy. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you. My name's Hao.
Hao? Okay,
Yep.
thank you. So again, when we start drawing, we immediately begin to frequently personalize how we're understanding the border, right? So whether it's our teacher or the large flag that we have from memory in the crossing, and sometimes maps shift as well, right? Proportions, how we're thinking about the space. I know there was another person who was about to come up here. Would you like to come up next?
Sure, thank you. So my name is John, and I drew the U.S.-Mexican border too. And 1965, I was stationed in Yuma, Arizona as a Marine at Marine Corps Air Squadron, and there is a little town not so far away called San Luis, Mexico. I went to Roswell, New Mexico 1 year, and down by Howell Caverns, and in that particular part of the country was the first nuclear explosion. And over in Texas, one time I was driving down to Guatemala with some friends, and we crossed Brownsville Station, Matamoros. I believe Matamoros translates into kill the Moors. Is that correct? Yeah. So you can see some of that history coming through. And there's just, personally, I just have quite a bit of history through those areas. And it's a very lovely part of the country, though it's getting hotter and drier. Anyway, thank you. Oh, I was just drawing the stand this young man was sitting in. I didn't quite get to draw him yet, though. Oh, we're leaving.
Thank you so much. Again, we can think about the ways that when we're drawing, we're often working from memories beyond just how we might look at the if we were consulting our device to see what the border line actually looked like geographically, right? We begin to insert memory. Maybe we draw a chair nearby and think about other kinds of borders in the immediate space. But it was pretty amazing. You were also offering us an etymology of a border town. So we're thinking about language immediately as we're thinking about borders as well. We could go on. In fact, I want someone else to volunteer to come up and share their drawing. Go ahead.
That way I can still see it while I look at it. I had the good fortune, my name is Joel, by the way. I had the good fortune to take students, high school students from Maine for many years to the Southwest on ecological study trips. So I got to know the Southwest, and since I gave up full-time work a few years ago, I've had, again, the good fortune to spend time there. So I drew the literal border, and it struck me a few years ago that how silly, how almost stupid it is when you're out standing there looking across the border, how it's just this imaginary line in somebody's head, and it's a weakness, almost a weakness of the human mind to have to put a border in a place like that. But I drew this from an ecological standpoint, and I put in mountains and saguaro cactus, and here's a tortoise and a jaguar on the southern side of the border that can't get across, and then rivers that are crossing the border or actually making up the border. There's a river in southern Arizona that actually flows north from Mexico across the border, which is real interesting ecologically. It's called the San Pedro, Ocotillo, and creosote going on across into Texas. I've got Big Bend here, and I even put a star there for the city of El Paso too, which is a good reminder. So anyway, that's my perspective on everything.
Thank you so much, Josh. Again, we're seeing very particular perspectives on what the border is. So we're again getting an ecological perspective. In the very beginning, we were thinking about the DMZs in terms of rich ecological zone, but the border itself has various biomes, right? So if we're looking at it from an ecological perspective, which we incidentally were in poems we're going to talk about, we begin to think about certain kinds of flora and fauna in the space. I'm also struck by the truck that you included. Like, I think like the kind of question of human beings as sentient beings in the space, but also mountains, various things, right? You're describing points like some of the other people who have drawn this space. Who would like to go next? Let's get like a couple more. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Or all the cables.
So, as a Muslim person, I sometimes think about the cultures that are shared. And so, when we talk about borders, we often say like, well, that wasn't there 1,000 years ago. So that's like a conversation we're constantly having. Like, when I was in Israel, Palestine, we remember saying, they were telling us the nomads, they had the free range to go from place to place. They weren't restricted like the Palestinians. And we said, that makes sense, because we're all really free people. And as a Muslim person in America, and many of my friends are abroad, I really feel the impact of what it means not to be able to go anywhere. And it affects me. But I did Ethiopia and Eritrea, because I lived in Ethiopia for 3 years. And we know that that's the Tigray tribe. Identical dress, identical food, identical language, but there's the divide. And when Eritrea had conflict, people were going back to Ethiopia for refuge. So that was ironic. And then I did Kashmir, and I had to ask a sister over there, what's on the other side of Kashmir? I know Pakistan is on one side, but my mind was so focused on Pakistan that I never even remembered that China, or we talked about Tibet, is on the other side. And I'm like, I'm very ignorant because I'm just focused on what is Pakistan doing in Kashmir, as a Muslim, like the responsibility of one Muslim country over another, and just completely neglecting the other side of it. So that's a long spiel, so thanks.
Thank you so much. What is your name?
My name is Mai, but my friends call me Noor.
Noor?
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you, Noor. I almost feel like there were two parts to your presentation. The first part where you were introducing how you did the drawing and the question of borders possibly within the United States too, or the US is creating a kind of border that keeps us in. And then the second part was certain kinds of geographies that we might or might not be familiar with, and other kinds of borders that could be cultural, as you were pointing out. So thank you so much for bringing these other ideas into the conversation. Is there time for one more? Would someone like to, one more person like to share? Oh, please, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm from India, Indian Muslim. So I'm very interested in the Indo-Pakistan border, but I never grew up with that partition imaginary, because I grew up in the south, and I'm more interested in the borders between Tamil Eelam area, Sri Lanka. If you know Sri Lanka has a Tamil population settled in there. So northern Sri Lanka is basically Tamil Eelam population, and Tamil Nadu, which is separated. The people from Tamil Nadu went and settled in Sri Lanka. They didn't go and settle, Britishers sent them as indentured laborers. So many borders, right? And then I'm in the US. I went to the borders at between Santiago and Mexico, I guess. Yeah. So all of these borders, too many borders. For me, borders was also like so much more about the Indo-Pakistan border is about how this divide between Hindu-Muslim is being constantly used. So I showed in my drawing how the border spills over through shadings into the country as Hindu-Muslim, divisions, and mostly like anti-Muslim. Now it's anti-Muslim hatred. So I try to show that, and with China and India, I try to show how the border is constantly shifting, but the BJP does not care about it, the party in rule. And on the other corner is the Tamil Nadu and Tamil people living in Tamil Nadu, and Tamil Eelam people living in Sri Lanka, and Sinhalese living in Sri Lanka. And this is the US-Mexico border that I saw in Santiago, which had like steel barricades through which you cannot see actually Mexico. You can only see in between the gap. So me and my sister went, and we were like seeing, and my sister and I couldn't move the border, so we just stayed in because we didn't have visa. So we just stood on this side watching it. So all of those borders. Thank you.
Thank you. What is your name?
I'm Misriya Sheikh Ali.
Mishriaski Kali. I'm sure I mispronounced your name, but thank you so much. So your drawing's incredible because you're bringing into conversation multiple zones of potential conflict around borders. And we have a colleague at UCSD who talks about this as a necklace of conflict, of hot zones. His name is Teddy Cruz. And he often describes the similarities between, for instance, the conflict between India and Pakistan and the United States and Mexico, that there's actually a lot in common with the question of borders and security, but also the general question of borderization as a concept. So I really appreciate you bringing that into the conversation now. I would like to pivot in the program, but I want to make sure there's no one else who really, really wants to present what they drew, because that would be so sad if we were like, we got to move on and nobody else can present. So is there anybody out there that really wants to present, or are we all good to like move on to the next segment of the program? Cool. Okay, well, we are going to present some of our individual work, then some of the work we've done together, and then we're going to have another exercise for you. Okay, thanks. Yeah, a round of applause for everyone for doing this opening exercise. Thank you.
Hola a todos, buenas noches. Es un placer estar aquí con todos ustedes. Thank you so much. We'd like to thank Sanctuary Media, Kathy, Branda, Ashley, David, Mike Bonnano, Yes Man, everybody who is here, Impact for inviting us. So what we like to do is go through our individual work and see how it connected with each other in conversation. And also always remember that it's a conversation that is collective. I always work with the Anarchist Five. I always work with artists, and it's usually for about 10 years on a single idea, and then it sort of moves forward. So technologies of disturbance from tactical media to Geo-Poetic Systems. Amy, Sara, Carroll, Ricardo Dominguez, and we are at UC San Diego, right at the edge of the US and the beginning of Mexico, or perhaps greater Mexico altogether. So I recently had a retro collective that was about the many different groups that I've worked with over the years, and it was based on a brief moment in a film by a friend of ours named Alex Rivera called Sleep Dealer, which is a speculative fiction about the future of the border and about a young hacker, Memo, in southernmost Mexico, who is hacking the satellites to get information about new forms of remote labor that are occurring in Tijuana, where people can jack into robots that then do the picking of fruit or making buildings, but that is, it extracts labor, but doesn't bring the human body in. As he's hacking, there is a close-up of a book, and it says Hacking for Beginners by R. Dominguez, right? So it was this moment of reality and speculative culture sort of meeting together. So this retrospective is the beginning, Hackear para Principiantes, Hacking for Beginners. So I could go back really quite far, but my training is in theater. Western canon, classical theater, Aeschylus to Carroll, Churchill, but I was deeply interested in agitprop theater, Teatro Campesino, Brecht, the Living Theater, Invisible Theater. And I ended up in Tallahassee, Florida in the early 80s. I worked in a lesbian bookstore called Ruby Fruit Books after Rita Mae Brown's famous novel, Ruby Fruit Jungle. There I met a group of other artists, again 5. It was Steve Barnes, one of the first people who ever touched a computer that I knew of. Next to him was Dorian Burr, a photographer, myself, a performance artist / agitprop street performance artist, Hope Kurtz, a poet, and Steve Kurtz, a filmmaker. And none of us really liked working, and none of us really liked our own focus of art making. So we were antagonistic against photography, filmmaking, poetry, computers. We were just against things. So then we decided, what are we not against? And so we said, well, we're not against making things, making gestures. So we decided to create a type of gesture that would, again, go against our anti-working thing, right? We didn't want to wait for the Musifier to ascend the brightest heaven of invention and say, this is the brilliant idea. And so we said, we need a really fast way to come up with ideas. So we decided on utopian plagiarism, which meant that we would take text that we like and plagiarize it and just shift a word. And so we made handmade books of poetry where we just shift a slight word to create new ideas. So many moons later, when the FBI or Congress or whomever comes and says, you guys are using poetry as camouflage for your disturbances, we say, you cannot love poetry more than sitting around making handmade books of poetry, right? So that's a lot of care. Now, the other thing was I was really interested in the body. I was doing a lot of blood work. I was a young performance artist. So I wanted to bring the body and these new kind of utopian plagiarisms. One of the things that came about was we were reading Thoreau's On Civil Disobedience from 1848, and we decided to put electronic in front of civil disobedience every time he mentioned that word. So suddenly we had a whole book on electronic civil disobedience. Now, we didn't have computers in the early 80s, so we could only imagine what electronic civil disobedience would be like. And we began to imagine that the body would be empty. It would be extracted by this new thing that we imagined via our utopian plagiarism as the data body. We imagined that in the future to come, only your data body would have value. Your real body, the real streets, the real communities would have no value. Everything would be extracted by virtual capitalism, right? So that came out of this notion of electronic civil disobedience, out of this notion of electronic disturbance. Now, one of the things that also occurred with these kind of gestures were what we called micro-gestures. And these were gestures that would create an invisible theater in which communities would gather and discuss what was happening. We wouldn't protest, we wouldn't block things, we wouldn't transgress, we would create a disturbance. So malls were new in the 80s, at least in Tallahassee. Nobody exactly knew what a mall was. And so we went to look at it and we discovered a mall was a simulation of public space. And the only right you had in a mall was to go buy something, right? That was your right. And there was surveillance and security. And if you did something other than look at commodities or buy a commodities, then you were suspect. So I went in with $20. I bought Hot Wheels. I bought a Burger King hat. But instead of being a good commodity fetishist, going home, breaking my commodity out and putting it on, I just broke it out right there at the exit and started playing with my Hot Wheels. Very soon, security came. Community gathered and they said, is this a Vietnam vet, a drug addict, a person who doesn't know what to do with their commodities? And so here the community that gathered had to speak to security about not arresting me or what have you. And it worked quite well. So the idea was then to begin to think about electronic disturbance, micro-gestures, the relationship between an invisible theater in which power would march on stage and enact, instead of us going, look at power, look at what it does, it would literally walk on stage and everybody could see its form. So that was the beginning of this kind of utopian plagiarism of ideas. Many of our friends began to die in the late early 90s of HIV, AIDS, and there was hysteria. This disease was, again, misunderstood by many, and certainly Ronald Reagan didn't really care. And so we began to develop cultural vaccine projects. Out of cultural vaccine projects came ACT UP Tallahassee, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which was really a global movement. And we began to do citizen science. Many of the people who were dying of AIDS and HIV were actually chemists, biologists, and others, and they taught us about citizen science and what we needed to do to speak to the NIH. Early Dr. Fauci was there, about Molotov cocktails of self-care, therapy, fast action. So it was really there that we began to do tactical media, fax jamming, call jamming. So to give you an instance, Publix, which was like Whole Foods in the South, decided not to sell condoms as a response to AIDS. We said that's
Not very good response. So ACT UP Tallahassee said, instead of aggressively shutting them down, let's use positive response. We said, we love Publix. We like to buy our condoms at Publix. We will buy all the condoms at Publix. And after 2 weeks of being called and fax jammed, they said, okay, ACT UP Tallahassee, we'll sell condoms. They said, yay, can you put them up front? Because we are busy and we don't want to go looking for them, right? So it was this kind of tactical shift, if you will. Now, one of the things that came out of this series of investigations in the 80s was a plagiarized book, utopian plagiarism, called Electronic Disturbance. Out of that came Electronic Civil Disobedience. They were published in the mid-90s, but they're really the writings of people in the 80s who had no computers, if you will. But the idea was that there would be an anonymous, secret, high technical group that would do all these actions against, powers that be. That was our plan. I went to New York City. I started working with Thing.net and started developing these ideas. But then in this time before browsers, before email, I was reading the RAND Corporation on on cyber war, cyber terrorism, cyber crime, but they had no electronic civil disobedience. So I started thinking about how do I do this, and I became a system administrator at an ISP called Thing.net. And out of that began the ideas of electronic civil disobedience that really achieved a constellation of a performative matrix of action when the browser came into being, which was 1993. It was called Mosaic, had reload, had images, hot links, if you will. The Zapatistas burst through the electronic force field and created digital Zapatismo. So I became a digital Zapatista 1 minute after midnight, 1994. I started working with them. I started telling stories of Mayan technology. I started thinking about how do I enact actions against cyber terrorism, cyber war, cyber crime. And the Zapatistas said, don't use high-end technology. Don't be anonymous, be poetic. So I said, poetry, I like poetry. So I decided to use cyber poetics. Out of that came Electronic Disturbance 1.0, Brett Stahlbaum, Carmen Karasik, and Stefan Ray. I never met him in person. It was all digital, right? And we developed the virtual sit-in technology using refresh reload buttons, right? And so people would go, Ricardo, we're hurting our fingers hitting refresh reload button on President Cedillo's website. I said, oh my God, I can't have your fingers hurt. So we decided to create a little Java applet that would count how many people came and do a virtual sit-in, right? That's what the language was. We were in the New York Times soon after, right? Virtual sit-ins occurred. We also used 404 files not found. So we would upload into the Mexican government website, does democracy exist here? The Mexican website would say 404, democracy not found on the Mexican government website. We would do virtual sit-ins on Department of Defense. Does justice exist? Department of Defense, justice does not exist. 404 was not a secret, but what was not existent in a site, right? And then I'll move quickly. This was an action we did against the U.S. Custom and Border Patrol. Ports are open on a computer, and this was in 2000, and we would shoot poetry into their servers. They said this was cracking. We said it was cultural exchange. I'm going to go really quickly. I won't go through this. When I came to, I was hired by UCSD. I had never been at the border for such a long time. I discovered that there was a relationship between Vietnam War and the US border in the development of electronic virtual fences. And so that really began another idea that will be developed with Amy. I'll go through this. I got a job, first job I ever had, teaching. They gave me pay, and so I was happy. I had my UCSD shirt looking at the Pacific. I went to the border like all of you, and suddenly Border Patrol came up and said, you have to be sad. You have to walk slowly. You can't be happy. So I knew that a disturbance would be quite simple. And so when I was hired at UCSD, and I'll end here, they said, what are you going to do, Ricardo? I said, well, I'm going to do three things. I'm going to do electronic civil disobedience and hacktivism. I'm going to use the supercomputers of the UC system against nation states, corporations, organizations that we feel are perhaps worth critical investigation. I'm interested in that. And ultimately, I'm going to use it against you, UC, if I deem it important, because I'm interested in institutional critique. They went, oh, computers, yay! The next thing I said is there's a long history of border art. I know I want to have a conversation with border art. It will probably involve technology and border art. And they went, technology, yay! And then I said, I'm interested in nanotechnology. I'm interested in interrupting particle capitalism, like genomic capitalism and digital capitalism. I need atomic force microscopes to investigate nanotoxicity, nanopoetics. And they said, oh, technology, yay! They didn't hear anything else. And then when these things did happen, they freaked out because it was more than technology. And so I'll stop there and introduce my partner, Amy, Sara, Carroll. Amy.
Okay, hello again. I'm going to quickly go through some of the ways that I've been writing. I also teach at UCSD now, although I've lived in various different places, taught at some other universities. I'm going to show you some of the kinds of poetry I was writing at different moments, and then we're going to, Ricardo's going to come back up here, and we're going to talk about a project we did together. So my first collection is called Secession. I really wanted to break away from most things in the United States. A third of it is lino-cut poems, like this, where I was carving poems and double dropping them. These are taken from a series called A Good Bad Girl's Alphabet. I'm just going to show you some of these. So the last one was double L. This is the letter S. This is the letter X. Of course, taken from a line. I was in a workshop with Lucille Clifton, and she said, Amy, X is for Malcolm. So that was the beginning of this poem. Many of these poems I wrote as gifts for other people. I didn't want to sell them. I wanted to give them to friends. I didn't really believe in a poetic economy that was necessarily about publishing, although these, in fact, I thought that I was writing an unpublishable collection. So I would often just make these for friends or people who were in my life, like this one that I did dedicate to Lucille Clifton and give to her. This is the letters BW. I might stop in a minute and read one of these. This is the letter N, Enye, in the Spanish alphabet. All the way around here is the alphabet in Braille, actually. So if you touch the block, you can follow the letters. A lot of these, I was also interested in performance and spoken word. So, I didn't put in those, but I was writing block poems, and then I was performing them in public spaces. I did some subtitling. This isn't showing up very well. I did kind of chaotic subtitling for film that was also a theatrical piece by a Mexican theater director who incorporated a silent film. This is a still taken from that. My second collection was called Fanny and Freddie, The Sentimentality of Post 9/11 Pornography. It came out in 2013 from Fordham. It was another book that I thought would never get published because I was working a lot with grayscale and strike-through. I'm kind of done with strike-through now, but at the time I felt like there was a bunch of us who were coming from very different spaces working with strike-through. I was also doing a lot of performance poems where I would see words in places. This was created literally with rock, dipping my finger in water, writing the word disappear, and then documenting the disappearance of the word on a summer day. So I was also painting on bridges and underpasses poems. So this is a poem that I painted the day after 9/11, and I was living in North Carolina at the time. I'm finding this really awkward, the mic and then looking up. I guess I should be looking down. So I also started writing these texts that involved a lot of grayscaling and strike-through. And I was really trying to think about ambivalence, and sometimes around politics, sometimes around aesthetics, sometimes around everything muddled up. So they looked like this. Then we started doing some actions. This was a piece that we did in San Diego right before the 2008 meltdown, where there was a lot of beginning of repo. And so this was like the spinning and a lot of sign spinning. So this was repro narrative subprime mortgages versus repo. And Zay, who is on camera there, is very little in this picture, wearing a peace, love, and cookies shirt. But you can kind of see that. And this one I like because there's the Alibi Lounge also and has repro narratives in front of it. The middle of the collection is pretty illegible, and we had a bit of a medical crisis with Zay when he was really little, and this the kind of confusion of facing potential a stack up of hospital bills, potential bankruptcy because of medical crisis. It very much inflects this book. And also creates this cognitive confusion that I was trying to document with the grayscale and strike through. We were living in Illinois at the time, so I incorporated things like the letter from the First Lady of the governor, as the governor was also being indicted for various criminal activities in the state of Illinois. This is, I was often just seeing words in places. This is actually my family from a long time ago, had a Viva Kennedy pin. I'm originally from South Texas. So I had this, it's like a kind of historical artifact, and I was incorporating it into things. Cool Baby Coo is exactly what I thought as I saw Zay's head crowning as I was giving birth, a little poem. So I was really interested in poems from the everyday. This is the denial of an insurance claim and then poems layered over it. This is like just playing around on the back porch with a bowl of peas when he was just a baby. Ricardo was most of the time in San Diego, and I was teaching my first job at the University of Michigan in single parenting. So poem writing had to be squeezed in between many other activities in a day-to-day. More recently, I've been working with lo-fi 3D poems, so you can see both sides of this. You print it on a double-sided piece of paper, cut it out, and build it into a box. I've done quite a few of these. I was also doing dissertation research in Mexico City. In the introduction, there was mention of the North American Free Trade Agreement. I started interviewing artists. So I lived in North Carolina when I got my PhD at Duke. But I ended up in Mexico City interviewing a lot of artists at the time who were reacting to the NAFTAification and the rethinking of borders. So I'm not going to go over all these artists' work, but this is the visage and like a popular toy of the president who signed NAFTA, the Mexican president, Carlos Salinas. This is work by the artist Vicente Rasso, playing with the image, the like everyday tchotchke of basically completely tanking the Mexican economy in the process of getting in this free trade agreement. So this artist had a museum called the Museo Salinas that he constructed in his bathroom of just street tchotchkes, just like protesting this particular president. And the idea was to stop making ready-mades at the bottom and start making your own museums. He did this with like cut-ups with the dictionary. We're going to do another writing workshop exercise at the end of our presentation, which will involve cut-ups like this particular artist was doing. Performance artist Lorena Wolfer doing billboard and other actions. The last piece was If She Is Mexico, Who Beat Her Up? 20 years later, her and I re-performed this piece in the Armory in Pasadena as If We Are Mexico, Who Beat Us Up? And in a retrospective of 1990s art from Mexico City. Here's Lorena Wolfer again, protesting femicide. Here, I should have given you a trigger warning before I showed this slide. This is the artist Teresa Margolles working with corpses in the Central Morgue in Mexico City, working with crime scene blood. So all of this is rising narco violence, the kind of blood on all of our hands, but she was creating canvases at crime scenes. And then this is a phrase she chiseled into a gallery in Queens. For those who don't believe, sons of a bitch, in the translation. And of course, this is about the question of a politics of free trade, for those of you who don't believe, right? The response. And then on the outside of the gallery window, crime statistics of narco violence in Mexico following the implementation of free trade. The last section in my book, I write about border art. This is a piece by Richard Liu in which he creates a piece that's an open door for a dignified crossing of the border in collaboration with the Border Art Workshop. This is a piece by Louis Hawk, Liz Cisco, and David Avilos, which was a bus poster project. The city of San Diego understands itself as America's finest city. They're very interested in thinking about San Diego labor politics as a kind of America's finest tourist plantation. So I could go on here, but I want to get to the Transborder Immigrant tool. I wanted to show you some of that work from both my poetry, but the research I did for you to understand how we arrived at working at this other project. So Ricardo, how about you come up and we'll talk about this one together.
Yeah, one of the elements, as I said, when I got hired at UCSD was I was interested in border art and some technological gesture. And speaking with Amy, who was doing all this research on border art, I was getting through osmosis and information about what the history was and the many amazing gestures that had been occurring. And one of the things that happened is Brett Stahlbaum, who was a member of Electronic Disturbance 1.0, who was in San Jose and working on his MFA at that time, and is my key collaborator, my true Thoreau. He had begun with his partner, Paula Poole, to do what was early GPS, or global positioning system, work. And if you remember, the US gave us in 2000 what we had paid for from the military global positioning system. And in 2007, a lot of the art was about urban or global positioning system. So interesting work might be, here is Palestine, here is San Francisco, we're gonna layer it, and the shoe store or Starbucks you're walking in Palestine is a destroyed hospital. So but it was still urban based, and I thought it was interesting, but I thought something else could be done. And then in talking to Paula and Brett, they love the desert. They love nature, like Thoreau. I can't stand nature, but I learned from his love. And he and Paula love to take really dangerous, outrageous walks in the desert, but they get lost. just walking down the street. So how do you do dangerous walks and not get lost? So they developed a small micro machine learning system that would prefabricate dangerous walks for them and then bring them back. And so I was having coffee with him, and I said, oh, that, you know, I like that kind of dislocative rather than locative art sensibility. And I said, like, you know, maybe we could switch towards navigating the desert in between Mexico and the US and use it. Could we find a cheap platform? And he said, yeah, maybe we could. And so that night I went home, I wrote the Transporter Immigrant Tool Manifesto. And it was going to do like all sorts of things, but at its core was poetry, right? Because I felt it needed something else in it. And so this became a really important kind of a question. And so I asked Amy, I said, hey, you're a poet. What do you think about writing poetry for this transporter immigrant tool? And she said, yeah, no, okay, well, never mind. But I tried and said, look at my manifesto. And so UCSD, I saw an email that said, funding for transporter cultural projects. I went, this is one. Right? So I sent it in, and they said, yeah, we'll give you $5,000. I said, good, you know, I can pay for poetry. Then I talked to my first two MFAs, because I had just been basically hired, and that was Eli Mermad, a mixed reality artist, and Misha Cardenas, a transmedia artist, right? And I said, you know, can we work together? And then Amy finally said yes to writing poetry. And so we developed this tool. It was designed to be simple on an iMotorola 335, which probably is less than nothing compared to the cell phone you have here, right? So we created a navigation tool, simple compass that would tell you where there was water in the Anza Borrego area in Southern California and in northern Mexico. And NGOs leave water. Unlike Arizona, there is a right to leave water in that area. Border Station Inc. and water stations. And then Amy started writing poetry.
I want to say one other thing about this, because of course, one thing that I neglected to mention when I was talking about research I had done was also the combination, and many of you may be familiar with this, of the relationship between the implementation of NAFTA and the incredibly heightened militarization of the border zone, right? So many people understand this by way of operations. For instance, Operation Gatekeeper, which Noam Chomsky describes as being a companion piece to NAFTA, in which there was a refunneling of migrant flows, and specifically away from large cities to very desolate, narrow stretches of the borderlands, including spaces in Arizona, including places like Anza Borrego State Park. So we began to think from this space when Ricardo was asking Brett about the question of using the virtual hiker for navigation. We were really thinking, this isn't about urban navigation. This is about navigation in spaces that have been weaponized, landscape. So when we were thinking about various drawings from Josh's to other people's of the borderlands, right, we're really thinking about the way in which arid stretches of the borderlands were completely understood by the federal government, the US federal government, in an aha moment as like useful for deterrence, and deterrence specifically entering this country, right? So our idea was, how could we respond to that? Rather naively, we were thinking this. Why was I saying I'm not sure if I want to write the poetry? Because I kept thinking, what kind of poem would you want in that space, right? If you have to choose between water and a poem, always choose water, right? This is like a kind of no-brainer. But what would it mean to include poetry on the project? So you've seen some of my other poems, so you might not be surprised that one of the first things I wrote was something like a diagram sentence from Luis Alberto Urrea's wonderful book that I would recommend to you called The Devil's Highway. And this is, of course, in the desert, we are all illegal aliens, right? Doesn't matter who we are, if we're in a desert space and we don't have water, we're going to be in trouble very quickly. So I like this sentence, this kind of facetious tongue-in-cheek sentence, but we also started doing other things because we were doing this is in San Francisco. Zay was very little in this image, but this is an image when we were water caching, playing with language, where aguas in the Spanish is a warning, right? But before we even got to work on this digital mural that was up for a little while, something else started happening. I started playing with other kinds of poems, and a Vice article, interview with Ricardo about the project, got picked up by right-wing media. So two things happened. This was Glenn Beck describing the poetry as not only helping, I'm going to put between, thinking in the Spanish, but in quotation marks, the word illegals here. But there was like this kind of incredible vilification of the project. So there were two ways that we could go on this, and one was at the same time, ironically, as the project was being vilified, all kinds of galleries and museums were writing us and saying, can we include your project in a show, right? So ironically, it was this both and reaction to the project.
One of the things that occurred was, remember that I got support for technology and anything, right? So the transporter immigrant tool gets $5,000, starts developing, we start figuring out how to compress all sorts of information into this little phone. Huh?
Just to clarify, when he said before he needed money for poetry, I did not take money for the poems I wrote.
No, I gave it to myself and I threw a great party. I don't know what happened to that money. No, I do. I know, we bought phones. But the main thing that happened was that once news in the right-wing media emerged that this project would dissolve the border with its poetry, yes, then Congress, the FBI, many institutions, and especially my university, decided to detenure me and to put me under trial. Other parts of Amy, Brett, Misha, Ellie were attacked verbally by right-wing media in various ways, but for some reason I was chosen as the sort of legal focus, right, to be detenured or what have you. So I had to get 5 lawyers. I had to get a labor lawyer, electronic law lawyer, criminal lawyer, art lawyer, immigration lawyer. And as you well know, lawyers are very expensive. So it took a while to develop a response to all of these things, but one of the core things that happened was that many of these entities refused to believe that we were all artists and refused to believe that this was within the sphere of artivism, let us say. And one of the things that Amy and I had discovered in an electronic poetry conference was a term by other poet scholars called Geo-Poetics. And so we said, well, what if this is not a global positioning system, but a Geo-Poetic system? And so what happened was that the authorities, the FBI's, everybody ended up reading poetry, which I think was a really interesting moment. The other thing that happened was that saved us was that a curator came and looked at the phone and said, could we put you in the show 50 Years of San Diego Art. We said, okay, that's good. So what happened was that my own lawyers didn't think it was art, what I was doing. They said, we never painting, sculpture, all these things. But then they saw that the project was at the San Diego Museum of Modern Art. And they said, how much did you pay them? I said, in my world, you don't pay them. They decide, they're curators. And they went, so it must be art because it's in a museum. And I said, yeah, well, we're artists, and this is an art project. So that created a force field, if you will, that helped us in the legal case. Then the poetry itself.
So I want to talk just a little bit more about the process of writing these poems, because the first diagram sentence that I showed you, I quickly decided was completely wrong for this project. We were spending a lot of time water caching, and I was having a lot of conversations with water cachers, with people in the desert space, with people who had undertaken this journey crossing. And I began to think a lot about poems that might actually be able to embed information about the space and survival. So when I said previously, like if you have to choose between water and a poem, always choose water, I still stand by that. But I want to qualify that one of the reasons we started to think about including poetry in the project had everything to do with conversations about immigration in the United States and the dehumanization of crossers. And we started to think about who is granted access to art and poetry as a matter of sustenance and who is not. And I kept thinking about Audre Lorde's essay, "Poetry is not a luxury." And from that space, I began to rethink the project. And I began to read a lot of desert survival manuals, a lot of actually military manuals about how to survive in the desert, manuals briefly distributed by the Mexican government to crossers. And I started to rethink this in terms of information about ecology. So there are poems about cacti, there are poems about spiders, there are poems about snakes, there are poems about how to figure out a North Star orientation, there are poems about general questions of survival. These are in both Spanish and English, and they are also in 2 indigenous languages at this point. I don't read indigenous languages, but people translated these poems for us. And this is the direction we went with them. They are available for free for download. We also ended up creating a book, which is not available for sale. My idea was that the book, we should never sell anything related to this project. So this book is a limited edition artist book that contains both the code for the project and the set of 24 poems, which are 1 for each hour of the day. And we're going to leave 1 copy of this book here, but you can also find the project if you want it, but I should say that. But you can also find these poems as both audio files and the poems online, and we can share those sites with you.
Then just quickly, because I think we should probably wrap up. And I'll send a URL of where you can find the poems and download them and all of that. And we're going to finish now with our and quickly, that is, one of the things is to move away from deterrence in terms of the land to this history of virtual deterrence. That is, the electronic is always at play in all of this. So we've been developing a series of gestures that not only read the current, say, Mylar that's being used on the border detention for children and others. Mm-hmm.
So my mother and I collaborated on this. This is actually made with Mylar blankets, and that are a kind of readily available, but also a symbol of the detention centers. And so when I was asking you all to think the mapping project, we created a map on a mylar blanket. Mylar is also the Roman god of the hearth or home space. So the breaking of the word is also about the idea of home.
So just to finish up, the latest thing we're developing is the palindrome. The border is the same forwards as it is backwards. And so the idea is to create a series of drones that are agents that cross back and forth across the U.S. border, that are active parts of a performance that we're doing, and will speak about border culture, border sensibilities, homeland security, drones. And it came out of a project called Drones at Home that we did because San Diego is the center of what is called Drone Valley. We produce 80% of all the unmanned aerial vehicles, such as the Predator drone, which is among the most famous, to hobbyist drones. And it's a multi-billion-dollar project that our university, UCSD, is part of that research. But often the researchers say, I'm just working on this little line of code. Oh, I don't know where it goes, right? And you're saying, well, this is where the kind of systems that it goes to. So it's gone through several iterations, the palindrome. I had like a real replica of the Predator that I was working on, but then we recycled it and just stuck a walkie-talkie on it that could go back and forth and we can play with. So we're going to stop there, and then maybe you can have a conversation.
No, we're doing a second. I don't know if there's
we don't have time.
I don't know if there's time for a second gesture with the community.
Maybe they can do it while we're talking.
Yeah, that would be one.
So if you want to, one of the things we thought of utopian plagiarism was the Yes Men did this great newspaper over there, and you could go cut it, take some words, take some glue stick, and randomly just put words together, and maybe there could be an idea, huh? A poem could come up, yeah?
Yeah, we were imagining that you could write found poetry. This was the second exercise that we wanted to do, but we don't have to do it if you feel there's not enough time. I'm not sure who we should be asking about time.
Yeah, it's only 1.5 hours.
We're good? So, yeah, so, here, I'm going to come off the stage now.
And if you want to look at the book, one of the funny things was that the FBI spent their time reading the poetry, and they said, is the code poetry? You said, code is poetry and the poetry is code. And then they asked, is the poetry encrypted? We said, all poetry is encrypted. And then they said, which poem is the most valuable? And we said, well, whatever poem you like best is the most valuable. And then they ultimately decided not to detenure me, not to try me for cyber terrorism or transgressing public law. And they now made me chair as my, for punishment of the department. So, yeah, you can maybe do that as you're over there doing cutting things. And maybe Mike, you can come up and we can talk. How's that? Is that okay? Yeah, and then...
All right, so everybody, while you're engaged in the collage, yeah, I'll move over here, I'll take the mic. So while you're engaged in the collage, we're gonna start the Q&A. So you have a chance to ask questions and maybe get answers. That's the way it sometimes works. Yeah. So we're going to do this we'll just have a seat here. Now, if anybody has a question while you're busy collaging, come on up and you can take the mic over here. I can wander around with the mic. Why don't we do it that way? Oh, we have two mics. Yes. Oh, yeah. That would work well if there's still videotaping going on. You look like you have a question. Sina has a question because you're holding a mic, so you must have a question.
Let me think about it. Oh, well, it's not on yet. Is it? I don't think the mic's on.
Oh, look at this amazing crew. You guys are on it.
Brandon can hear me?
Oh, okay.
Let me think.
Yeah, there's also going to be an opportunity to do readings of your poems, your creations, your plagiarism.
We thought that it was important to do that. I don't know if this is on.
Can we have,
1, 2, 1, 2.
microphone 2 and 3 up?
Yeah. 1, 2, 1, 2, yeah. Yeah. Cool. The idea that Amy and I was that a lot of this came out of this cut up, right? The Situationists did it, Burroughs, Geisen did cut ups, and we did utopian plagiarism as a way to develop our ideas. So we thought we could play with that as well.
But I was going to say also, can you hear me?
Just
okay, good. That within contemporary poetics, there's a lot of conversations around conceptual writing, documentary aesthetics, and as well the conversations about so-called, and I want to put it in quotes, uncreative writing. What is uncreative writing but the borrowing, recycling of language? Again, a kind of aesthetics which is about found language, ready-making, right? So this is a relatively, I think, fun gesture when we really begin to think about how could we relocate language, but also can be incredibly profound.
Closer to the mic, she can't hear it.
I have a really basic question. When we're looking at that slide of the or that picture of the walkie-talkie or the radio hanging off the drone, what is it that we're seeing? What does it do? I might have just been like zoned out or something, but I don't understand what happens with the drone.
Well, one of the elements that I've been investigating since I've been at UCSD is the relationship between UCSD, the Vietnam War, and the development of unmanned aerial vehicles, specifically focused on developing what is called the virtual fence. And this goes back to that particular period. So what happened was that McNamara, who was leading the Vietnam War, had stationed the border of South and North Vietnam, and this was called the McNamara Line. And so he wanted to create a new type of weapon, and that would deal with creating an electronic force field that would eliminate the movement of any enemy across that field. And so he went to UCSD and he created a group of hyper superstars of engineering, research, and physics, and they were called the Jasons, after Jason and the Argonauts. And they met at UCSD in 1968, and they developed the first virtual field using drones. And so I have images, but basically the Navy, working with IBM, would have these offshore stations. They would send a drone, an unmanned aerial vehicle, over the McNamara Line. They would drop sensors, chemical sensors and sound sensors, and every time there was a chemical, like human sweat or beats of movement. I don't know if you saw King Kong, the new movie. They dropped those sensors, is what they are. And it would relate that information to the drone. The drone would send it to the IBM offshore systems. They would see it on their monitors, and then they would bomb the hell out of that area. Now, the North Vietnamese quickly understood what these were, and so they would take buckets of piss and put them next to the sensors. The sensors would say, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese here. The US would go bomb that area, and of course the Vietnamese would move into other areas. So what happens when the McNamara line fails and does not work based on these genius plans? They sell it to US Border and Custom Patrol, which starts using this technology, right? So I start investigating then unmanned aerial vehicles, and I see a TV show many years later called Briar Patch, and there they have this U.S. Custom Border Patrol renegade uses hobbyist drones to go out into the desert to find individuals and bring them in with the drone. So I thought that would be a nice recycling, if you will. So Amy and I and other artists started writing a play, and we're going to do it at the border with the drone going back and forth.
Well, I'm going to say a couple of other things, because one thing that we've been in conversation about, I mean, we could spend all night talking about the history of like militarization of the Mexico-US border, right? But definitely post-2001, there was a huge uptick in the use of certain kinds of surveillance technologies. And so the drone is ubiquitous within the borderlands, right? So we're trying to think what would happen if you were actually using a ubiquitous technology that is basically of the carceral state, right? And recycle in the same way that you all are with language right now. What can we do with this, right? So one of the projects that we're thinking about relative to, we were invited to participate in the Mexicali Biennial, was really researching like, are you allowed, so the curators were helping us, you can actually fly a drone back and forth across the border, right? That is not illegal. So what would it mean to respond to, say, the drones of Homeland Security with certain kinds of languaging delivered by way of drones? This was one thing that Ricardo was talking about. That's not the exact project that we're doing, just to be clear. We started to think of the drone as an activated prop within a play we're writing for the biennial project. But one of the things that we want to draw attention to, in the same way that we were trying to draw attention to the construction of the borderlands by way of, say, the Mylar blanket, is deactivating one representation of the blanket or of the drone and reactivating it in another way as a kind of border abolitionist, by way of a border abolitionist logic. So this is what we're thinking about with this project. So lots of ideas. How it's going to play out on the ground is a whole nother question. So what you're seeing when you actually see that image is the design problem of the sound system, right? So we try all kinds of things, but we can't project the sound of the by way of the drone. The easiest way right now seems to be with this like kind of makeshift hanging a walkie-talkie off the drone to project sound. We actually we were going to talk about this in our entire presentation at Impact that ended up not happening, oddly enough. There's a title in the presentation, The Flight of the Palindrome. Our flights get canceled, right, on the airline.
So that's what we're going to focus on originally as a
But
whole.
the design problem is one thing that we're really interested in talking to people at Rensselaer about. That was one thing that the curator who invited us was thinking about. You're looking super skeptical.
No, I'm not skeptical. I was just saying we have some real talent in this room when it comes to speakers and projection. And I mean, Jason here is a PhD student in our department who does a lot of work with acoustics and thinking about these issues. And this is something that this kind of theater, this cross-border theater using drones and speakers, either tiny or big, is something that I've come across in military and industrial contexts, specifically to do with the border. Like I went to a border security conference in San Antonio. I was representing a border security company at the time, fake company, but still at this conference. And they had this live fire demonstration. So the conference had everybody showing their technologies, and most of them were remote sensing and some targeting type things. But the really interesting moment was when a lot of drone stuff. The really interesting thing was when we went out for the field demo, which was out in the countryside in Texas, and there were a lot of like shooting contests and stuff like that. But the greatest bit was that they had this drone lifting LRADs up into the air. So LRADs, these long-range acoustic devices that were extremely loud. Basically, they're like really loud speakers, and they made some really small, really loud speakers that you fly with a drone. And they had all of these fantasy purposes for these that were cross-border. It was like, how do you reach people when you can't touch them, or you're not allowed to do something physically to them? So they had a lot of, and they had this LRAD flying over the site where everybody was running around shooting things and playing with the toys the entire time, and they were making these crazy sort of fantasy announcements about like warning people not to cross a line or not to get closer. So I think there's a lot of places to look.
That's I think the original idea in 2013 with the Drones at Home show was that the palindrome would be a search and sing drone that would chase the Homeland Security predators and then send the cultural valiancies of Nortec, of Gloria Anzaldúa, to the pilots at Critch, Nevada, so that it would interrupt the cycles of sound. And so again, how does one develop? And then right now I have been looking at Palantir and Anduril, who are using these drones to not only chase immigrants, but to hit them with, what is it that cops mistakenly shoot you, but they should use,
Don't tase me, bro.
Tasers, right? And so it flies out, finds you, and then tasers you, right?
Yeah.
And say the other made General Atomics is right across the street from UCSD, and what their concern is right now is the Sky Guardian, and this will be a mega unmanned aerial vehicle that will never have to come down, and its basic purpose is to survey over a 400 or 500 mile range the birth to death of an individual, and that will be able to do surveillance on an entire community and download it into servers in Utah, where the NSA are. And so again, these kind of different scales of dronology. And so the palindrome would be one particular reflection, and there certainly have been, as Amy presented, history of unmanned aerial vehicles on the border. Alex Rivera did the low drone, right, which was a lowrider drone in 2005 that you could drive and listen to music as you were driving it. The Minutemen had little hobbyist planes that they would survey the border with. So it's, again, a long conversation, but again, how do we quickly recycle language? So, yeah.
Thank you.
One more question.
Does somebody have a question from out here in the room?
Poetry reading.
We can also intersperse poetry and questions.
Anybody have a poem? Yeah.
Yes.
The only thing I know about this space is the group Anonymous. Do you know them? Are you friends with them? Do you like them or not like them?
In terms of the hacktivist group. Well, you know, one of the things with Critical Art Ensemble, when we wrote Electronic Disturbance and Electronic Civil Disobedience, and when I got to New York City, the idea was it was going to be an anonymous group of high-level technologists who would work on taking down whomever was the focus. And so that was my idea, right? I went to 2,600, I went to all these people, you know, let's do this. And then the Zapatistas emerged. And they said, well, you know, maybe you should do something that's not anonymous. Go against the anonymity that virtual capitalism was selling. AOL, Yahoo was saying, no, in cyberspace, nobody knows you're a dog or a cat. So anonymity was being sold as what the internet was about. So we decided to be transparent. We said, I'm Ricardo Dominguez, Stefan Ray, Brett Stahlbaum, Carmen Karasik. We live at this place. This is our telephone number, whatever. Here's the code. And they freaked out, right? You're not supposed to tell us that. You're supposed to be secret. We're going, no, here's the element. So many years later, after hacktivism has emerged around Battle in Seattle, you had electro-hippies, Federation of Random Action, doing similar things, but then Anonymous emerges. What is interesting about Anonymous was that they were a group of hackers who took on Scientology and started doing protest in the streets. So the first time I saw Anonymous was in LA in front of Scientology, and they were wearing the Vendetta mask. So what was interesting about Anonymous was that they literally did what we had been asking, that is, to data bodies to march in the streets, to march in nonviolence. So I think that was really, to me, a key moment for Anonymous. I think in terms of hacktivism, I certainly like some of the actions they've done. Sometimes I don't necessarily agree with all of them. But I do disagree with the general tendency of anonymity. But post 9/11, it became apparent that many students, artists, and others were interested in anonymity, in camouflage, because it was far too dangerous. If you're in the Philippines and want to take down the police server, you don't go, hello, I'm teenager so-and-so and I live in this street, because they'll come and kill you. So it's good to understand that post 9/11, the privileges that I had as a citizen of empire of doing this kind of transparent work was not really a trajectory that was as useful aesthetically. And this was a question that came up with the transporter immigrant tool. Should we be transparent, right? Should we be opaque? Not tell people. And then the decision ultimately with Amy was to think out translucency, where we would tell people who created it, what the code was, but we wouldn't tell people who the users were. So it was translucent, kind of a long, I don't know if that really answers, but that balance. Should we read some poems, or yeah, go ahead.
Just an observation. I'm finding it really fascinating because borders are used as control by governments mostly to keep us apart, to keep you in your place, and to use then words, which have always been perhaps really baseline of society, to break those borders down, and to use it creatively to break borders down. I just find it fascinating. I mean, it's in sort of to this, it's like a simplification of everything that you're talking about in some ways, and just that. I also remember, I mean, it comes out differently. It comes, you can go back thousands and thousands of years and see how governments have worked with borders, and yet how really those borders are all imaginary. And so as a result, usually the human populations that are around there, the animal populations, are working in the other direction, wanting to break those borders down at all times. Governments being more creative to make the borders harder and firmer, and at the same time, constantly, the natural forces are trying to break that down in the other direction. So just, that's all.
No, I think that's a really lucid take. There's a marvelous book by a philosopher, it's called Poetics, which is a history of flows and borders. And what we have is a long history of nomadic flow, whether it's animal life, plant life, human life, and the different curvatures and lines that have stopped Geo-Politics from occurring. And so that the one way that Amy taught us, I think in a really useful manner, that the aesthetics of Geo-Politics might be that we approach borders not as political governance lines, but as earthworks, earth art, because that then would allow us to aesthetically reshape them. If we don't see them as valiancies of the political, because then it becomes difficult for the authorities who often want to legalize or create laws if we respond in an aesthetic manner. So the, say, authorities who came to shut down the transporter immigrant tool suddenly had to deal with a Geo-Politics of aesthetics, which was more difficult to process. So they could have shut down global positioning system, but it might be more difficult to shut down a global Geo-Poetic system. It's a different dialogue, perhaps. I don't know.
Hi, I had a question because we're talking about language, and I remember watching something online with Haymarket lectures, and they were saying when you don't identify something correctly, then it's prolonged. The life of conflict is prolonged. Do you find with the NAFTA, the language that is used so the public can understand it has drastically changed, or is it still that political language that people really don't become engaged with?
Yeah, this is a really huge question. Thank you so much for the question. I was going to say there's a collection of poetry called AH, which you might be familiar with, which is by a poet called Hugo now I'm spacing on his name. Hugo Garcia Manriquez, I believe, but we'll double check it in a minute. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because he actually does something like what you all are doing right now as a gesture, and that is take the full text of NAFTA in Spanish and English and grayscale parts of it so that certain words pop. And I think like a few things happen in the process of doing this. A poem is created using nothing but the language of NAFTA itself, but repurposing it. But another thing that happens is to think about the violence of language in the context of the actual treaty itself. And so what happens when we begin to think about the structural violence of language in this context, which is the language of bureaucracy, a language of governmentality, right? And what can we do to, in some ways, undocument that language? So what you're doing right now, this gesture that all of you are working on, we were calling it a gesture of undocumentation, where you take certain language and repurpose it, right? So I think one powerful way, and there have been a lot of debates, I want to add, about a documentary or conceptual writing practice, but in its best articulations, for instance, Lady Long Soldier's collection called Whereas, which is repurposing certain kinds of government documents related to the treatment of indigenous communities in this country, we get a reclamation of the language relative to identity, right? So I think that, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think that we must start, our starting point must be that language in many instances is violence and it is weaponized, right? So how do we try to retake language? Now I'm remembering the second thing that I wanted to say to you, and that's relative to how we say it, how we name things. And this is where I think periodization is really, really important, where we can say a marked shift happened in 1994. We can look back and say, no matter what we might have what we might think of periodization. The theorist Frederick Jameson says one cannot not periodize, and that double negative there feels so important to me in terms of thinking. We can think all the negatives of periodization, and we still might need to do it to say there is a marked shift in how the border is being configured after 1994. And that's what we've been really trying to think about in our work consistently. I don't know, that was a lot in terms of an answer. I hope it was helpful. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, no, I think for me, 1994 was a key moment in a lot of the work, and certainly one could say it was a major manifestation of a deep economic war on the globe, on that planet, that became more than apparent of what it was already. It also enabled that utopian or anti-utopian moment of connection at the same time. I was able to meet different communities on a global scale in '94 as well. So it was this moment of basically a critical art ensemble said we artists were always contemplating apocalypse or utopia. And when we came off the airplane here, it says utopia is pretty close by, right? That was a poster we saw.
In the Albany airport.
So that is, in Troy, you're between apocalypse and utopia, like all the time. And so how do we navigate those moments? And for me, it's always been this gesture of the poetic. And even though I myself might not fully understand its conditions, I always am attracted to its potential. And for instance, the Yes Men used the poetics of camouflage, opacity, and then transparency, right? And we use transparency, and then it gets into the poetics where people are going, what is this, right? So again, it's this kind of same theatrical gesture, and we reverse it, and we learn from each other and those histories. And sometimes actions and gestures, we have to go from opacity, camouflage to transparency, or the reverse. And some of us get really good at understanding that, right? You're saying the Yes Men understood in the Battle of Seattle, kind of in immediate sense, we can reverse this and enter the space. And we were doing we were exiting and they were entering, but they're doing the disturbance, right? Entering WTO. Yeah. And we were trying to exit WTO, but they both were disturbing it. I don't know, to me that's theatricality, that's poetics of imagining not having to live in apocalypse and not having to live in utopia, but in something better than those things. I think is this place right now, Sanctuary, is perhaps that place that is something more than apocalypse and utopia. So whatever that might be. Maybe you're making it right now. Does anybody want to share a poem?
I think. Are you waiting for the mic?
Yeah.
Yep. Jason's up.
You got a poem? Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the talk. I have a couple of questions. And as you just mentioned from the previous answer, theatricality seems to be like a very feedback. Yeah, theatricality. Let's do that. Theatricality is a big part of your work and also Yes Men's work. And kind of what I was always curious is how do maybe even Yes Men can answer this for me too, but how do you connect theatricality with activism or the work you engage with the community? Because theatricality is very, in my thought, is very fragile. It's really hard to create and is really hard to sustain. And when you try to connect that with some type of activism, that transition can be, it feels it can be very rough. So I was curious how you kind of go wrestle with it or manage with it, or don't care if it messes up, or And the second question is about poetry. Like I was reading the book, and I'm multilingual, multicultural, and language, there's this blurry place, and I also kind of see it in your work too, a blurry place between language and also material. Like, and also you deal with a lot of diagrams, code, and various languages and material. And how does poetry work in those blurry diagrams and those things in between?
Well, I'll let Amy take the poetry and the question of activism.
Yeah, so I think poetry exists in lots of different places. I think we're trained to imagine it's only in like the hushed reading in an academic space, but I'm really interested in a poetry that would be more diffuse and would, be incorporated into our lives on a daily basis. So I think that for me, there might be another approach to the question, because it became, in this particular project, a design question for me, Jason. And what kind of poem would you want in a desert space? Would you want on a tool? And how exactly would poetry work here? And again, my touchstone was Audre Lorde's essay, but also work of poets like Raúl Zorita, right, in the Chilean context. I actually don't think the two questions are disconnected, I want to add too. So it seems to me within social movements, poetry has played a key role, right? And an embrace of a poetry that would infuse our lives and be of the everyday. If we think about anything from the Chicano movement to the Black Power movement to certain kinds of feminist movements, poetry has played a key role. So I was really drawing on and within the Mexican context as well, poetry is central to an everyday life and practice. I was thinking about Javier Cecilia within the Mexican context after the murder of his son, challenging the state in terms of no more violence, but saying to the state, but you wouldn't understand the language of poetry. I'm thinking about the way poetry was functioning in the Arab Spring. Similarly, a lot of the protest was in the form of couplets, right? So if we tell ourselves poetry is not something that's only reserved for an academic space, but could actually be part of an activist, imagine how we understand an artivist or activist practice. I'm really interested in that, and that figured here. Like investigators of the project, as soon as they could understand that this was poetry, they're like, oh, it's an art project because there's poems. When they looked at the code, they couldn't see the code as poetry as well. I saw the code of this project as being its first set of poems. And then I was writing some extra poetry for the project, right? But that slippage between what was code and what was poetry, that's what that book is about, right? Insisting that it's both and. Regarding performance and theatricality, I think the state is always a performer, right? The market is always coded in the language of performance and the theatrical, in the terms of spectacle, especially in the 20th and 21st century. So I see that question of the repeat performance of the border almost demands the counter of a performative gesture. I don't know, you might say something else entirely.
I tried to make clear at the very beginning, I was trained in the theater, so I always interpret everything as a theatrical gesture. I was interested in agitprop theater, street theater. I was interested in teatro campesino, right, taking theater out to the community. But one of the things that happened in the early 80s was that I had to start imagining with others what would be a digital or virtual theater. And we called it a performative matrix. And this performative matrix was going to be a performance of data bodies and real bodies. And that data bodies would have the greatest stage, and real bodies would have a minimal stage. And so I would do performances, and you can do this too. Go to a bank, go talk to the manager of loans, and say, I'm Ricardo Dominguez, or whatever, Mike Bonnano, and say, Amy loves me, my mother loved me, can you give me $10,000? And they would go, what is your data body? Right? What is your social security, your credit, whatever? It's not you. It's not your vision, your faith, your creativity, all the work you've done in sanctuary. It's your data body. So one can use the performative matrix to show the performance of what is valued. Is it the streets? Is it the buildings? Is it water? Is it, I don't know, whatever else that's going on? It's usually the data body somehow. And at this point in time, the data becomes the predominant factor of exchange, of being, of becoming, of gathering. So we had to think of some other way to reconvert that. And certainly Zapatismo, digital Zapatismo, allowed us to begin to think about la tierra, the earth, communities, indigenous futurity, histories of poetry and protest that destabilized, disturbed data bodies and virtual capitalism. At least that was the idea. But I still couldn't give up on the idea that we would perform, that we would create a stage, a recombinant stage, and might not look like this stage, but it was floating around and it was attached to us. So I'll stop with this particular thing. So how did we stage virtual sit-in? We took Gandhi's notion that the value of civil disobedience in the streets is that the police can come hit you, right? They can come hit you and people go, look at these people are so deeply embedded in their ethical belief of protecting this space that they can shout poetry and have the police hit them. And we were going, how would that happen virtually, right? If I'm on my computer, how are the cops going to come hit me so that people can say these people have some presence or value? And so what we did is we were transparent with our data bodies and our code. And so we would call up the Department of Defense. We're coming to do a virtual sit-in next Friday between 1 and 3. Here's the code. I live in Williamsburg. Call me if there's a problem. And so then the FBI and people go, but aren't you supposed to be secret? Aren't you supposed to be hiding your data body? So again, performing a different recombinant structure of what that value is, and rather than having it extracted into some cyberspace, having it become part of the Sayagraha, the spirit body that can be in the streets, that can be located as a value. I don't know that, but it's still for me theater. And theater is Greek for me. 5th century Athens, and that was about democracy. And so theater for me is always about what is democracy, what is its values, how do we express it. So again, odd connections with theatricality.
And I mean, poetics and symbolic action stories are often what drives movements and become the flashpoints of activism. You know, so if you want to take a page from the Indian independence movement, for example, Gandhi, the stories that we tell about that movement are things like stories of the Swadeshi movement, the movement of self-reliance, you know, people going, marching to the coast and then evaporating seawater to make salt in defiance of the taxation on salt and the restrictions on getting that critical product for free that should be freely available as a sort of human right, that the British were imposing on them and using as a tool to impose the colonial power structure. And so that gesture of self-reliance is a symbolic action. It's like they're not actually going to be making enough salt for the whole year. They're doing it for a moment just to prove that it's possible to do it and to not do what the British government says you have to do. But it becomes the story of movement. It's like Rosa Parks sitting on the bus. It's theater. It is real. It's a real gesture. It's crossing a border. It's boundary crossing. It's doing something illegal. It's hacking the system. But it's also a symbolic action that's simple and catches everybody's attention and is repeatable and actually had been done by hundreds of other people before Rosa Parks, before history caught up with that action at the right moment and it captivated everybody's attention. So it's like I think, that question of what are the poetics, or how does activism work through this kind of balance? I think you were saying the tension or the balance. I think the answer is there's lots of bad examples too. There's lots of times where it goes, what do you call it, pear-shaped? It goes wrong, doesn't quite work, doesn't resonate. It's like a bad movie. You have like bad symbolic actions that are part of movements and they don't really fly. Some that get a massive amount of attention and are great, and some that get almost no attention but are still great in the same way that a great poem that only one person reads can still be great. So, but in terms of like from the, like with the stuff that we did with the Yes Men, the idea was always to try to get more eyes on it, to try to have an influence, to try to then, in some kind of tangential way, influence policy, or at least influence minds in a way that has an impact on the movement, that bolsters people who are doing the harder work of organizing. That's also the most important part of activism. So, I
think that's really important. Is activists for me are people who are doing the deep work, the research, getting the atomic facts of the situation, and you have, for me and for all of us, it takes a long time to do something. I mean, it sounds like I was going, we did this, but it was long research between concept, gesture, and response. And if I tell my students, take one idea for 10 years, they go, oh man, you're crazy. You can't, but you have to meet the researchers, and they could be academic, they could be people in the community who actually know this kind of information, and then it takes a while for the community of artists to sit around and think about it. And for instance, I went to a Grand Fury meeting that ACT UP. I don't know if you've ever seen Silence Equals Death, and it's the pink triangle and there's a black. Grand Fury were all painters, and there was like maybe 12 of them. And at the meeting, their argument was, how do we cure AIDS? Or it was, what is the right color of pink? And they were having down fights, I hate you. And it was around a color, the bright, precise color. And so activists, I don't think, have time to sit around going, hey, that blue, I like that blue. No, that's got to be this, right? And I think as artivists, Amy can spend time thinking about poetry. We can spend time thinking about these things and then transgressing our aesthetics, right? You saw Amy, this is the way I did work, and suddenly I did this kind of work. I don't think activists have time to sit there and go, gosh, I don't know, green, Geo-Poetics, because my friend is in jail. And I know what jail, and I know what we need to do. So I think that's maybe a too hard of a difference, but as an artist, I think what I have to always tell myself is that I have to be patient and learn I watched Amy write about border art and NAFTA, and so I learned from the deep dive. I don't know, that's also really important, I think.
Do we have a poem in the house?
They got a poem? Anybody got a poem? No? Yeah? Read a poem. Yes. Just it's late, and so. Yeah.
Come on up. Come on down with your poem. We have a microphone. We have a nice set of maps that you can stand with. Yeah. This is not a poem. So if it's something else, go for it.
I just is it working? Yeah, okay. I just wanted to correct something about the Swadeshi movement, for example. Like 1.5 years back, I would have totally had your version of the Swadeshi nationalism. And of course, Gandhi just did one aspect of Swadeshi, but it was more connected to Swaraj, which is home rule. And his advocacy was more behind Swaraj. But since Swadeshi became a governmental policy-making agenda that is self-reliant, making self-reliant India. Now, Swadeshi is more of a neoliberal discourse in India with Modi and stuff, and even before Modi, from Jawaharlal Nehru and everyone else. So the one thing that I would say is that 1.5 years before, we did not have that kind of understanding, precisely because much of the Swadeshi movement had a lot of Hindu supremacists in them. And like if you take Performing Nationhood, Mimosha Pandit's work, so she like totally unpacks how Hindu supremacy runs deep in the Swadeshi Hindu nationalists, and many of the Swadeshi nationalists did not even want Britishers to leave. So and that's where the complexity really comes from. And so now, because in the last 1.5 years, a lot of Muslim activists are reinterpreting the histories we are told that is so imbricated in Hindu supremacy and Hindu nationalism, and to portray this image of India being a Hindu nation always and like quite culturally, and not so much politically, not so much as the constitution would have it, but so much more as a cultural phenomena. So we are doing that work. So here is my 2 words on that word. So on that.
Thanks. That's great. I'll have to do some research, because I have not been following the last 3 years of reinterpretation. So thank you. It's great to know.
Well, I think that is, again, we always have to try to learn from those who are, in the, how shall I say, the activists or communities in those spaces, because again, you have to have those conversations if you haven't had that opportunity. And so thank you. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah.
Does anybody have other comments or corrections or one poem to end? Anybody want one poem?
We got one poem.
Wrap it up with one poem.
There you go. Yeah.
Going once.
Bye-bye.
Going twice.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
All right. Well, I was going to, maybe as we wrap up and do the poems, I had a student of Amy and ours named Saul Hernandez, who's been doing work on the U.S.-Mexico border. And again, he told us this historically bound story that or this story about the U.S.-Mexico border, was that when it was decided that there was going to be a division, they sent a series of geographers with all the latest tools of that time to sort of do the line drawing, if you will. But as they were doing this, their tools broke. So then they had to figure out, how do we finish the US-Mexico border if we have no technological tools to do it? So they decided to use starlight. And so that the US-Mexico border was made by starlight that guided them in their drawing of the border. So again, kind of mysterious and poetic element so when I drew my border, I said made by stars. Anyway, yeah. So I'm just doing some time while we get some poetry. Bad stars. Bad, dead stars.
No bad use of
Bad use of dead stars.
not the stars themselves.
The stars have no fault. Almost a poem.
I think.
Almost
Are
a
we
poem.
having a poem? Is this happening, or are we?
Yes, just share it. You can
If
read
it's
it.
if it's happening, it's happening. Okay,
we
great.
Can end.
Come on up.
You want me to put it up? Yeah, let's put it up. Here, I'll hold it.
I don't know. I guess this is just like. Oh, hi. Okay. I don't know how to do this. Anyway, I think this is kind of just like residual rage from like 2020 on a page. But yeah, like really seeing like Trauma's face and like Pence's face, like it really just brings up some feelings. It's the whole like idea about like kind of like Trump hacking into the White House and like taking, residency, and the whole idea of like how he like kind of illegally crossed that, I don't know, that metaphorical like border. I think that kind of comes up for me. We're just like, he got evicted, bye-bye resident. I don't know, that's what I kind of think when I look at this.
It's both rage and a celebration, I think. I don't.
Take a bunch and start one somewhere and play with words.
Do you want to read? I can't see it from here.
You want to start closing?
No, I don't know. Bye bye resident. Intro. I can't. Oh, this is our America too. Next, learning to feel. Just great folks. Crisis. Powered ions teenagers. Bring him down. The humans spend neighbors. And there's also like read across Trump's place.
Yeah, it says read deplorables and Trump defense. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. Do we have one more poem coming up? Did I see somebody? No, we're good. Are we good? Are we one more poem? Going, gone. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you, Amy and Ricardo, for coming out here, and Zay for being the extra camera person tonight, and the other camera people whose names I don't all recall, except for Kathy up front, and those people who are downstairs that you can't see that are in the booth that are doing the recording as well, Troy and company, Steve in the back on the board. Thank you, Steve. Brenda, who is hovering around here somewhere, always doing her thing. Sina, who got the camera in her hand over there. Mike, who's here, sitting here in this chair. And thank you all for coming. And there will be more events in the future. And we just really thank you for coming out here, all the way out here for this. So cheers.